Application Note 309, Introduction to Variables, GUI events, and indicators. And in this application note, we're going to give you just a brief introduction on how you can make your GUI come alive. Not just laying out elements on your GUI, but starting to make indicators and things change and move on your GUI. Okay, so let's start off with a new project. And I'm going to go fairly quickly to scaffold this project. If you haven't watched the box model introduction application note or the creating a header application note, you probably want to go back and review that right now. And then when you watch me do this setup process, it'll be pretty obvious what I'm going to do. But let me walk you through new project, AN0309, B, and it's for a SIM 231 A03, and I'm going to choose a minimal project. And this has very little on it except our logo right in the middle. Okay, let's create a header that has a few indicators on it. So we'll start by adding a new frame at the top, and that frame is going to, or you could use a box, and that frame will be the width of the screen. The height will be, let's say, 50 pixels. Oop, that's the width. Let's go into the height. 50 pixels. There we are across the top. Set a background color just slightly different. And then we're going to chop that frame up into a left side, which will have a text indicator, and a right side, which will have a more of a flashing box color indicator. So add new text frame in this case. We're going to put the text frame on the left, and we're going to make it 200 pixels wide. And then we're going to, on the right side, add a box this time. And it is going to be, the width is going to be the same as the parent's inner height. Parent.inner height, which will make it square, and we'll horizontally align it to the right. And we'll add some padding on this box, let's say 5 pixels all around. And in this case, we're going to use inner color, not background color, because we want the indicator to show up as, let's say, red, with a little bit of a border around it, in this case, padding around it. So let's go back to this text frame, and just so you can see it, we're going to add a background color as well to this, so you can kind of see the elements. So we go to header, text frame on the left, box on the right, and in the text frame we're going to add a label or a text object. Here we are. Here's the text object, and we're going to give it a preliminary value of question RPM, and you can see where it is. Let's center it. Text. Of course, we'll set it on the text frame because it's in a frame, and the horizontal alignment is centered, and the vertical alignment is centered. Okay, so now we've got a question RPM. Now we can split the text up and get really fancy here, and we can just make this RPM, and we can use a text size. This is 32. I'm going to add a new font here. I'm going to add another size, and I'm going to make it 20, and then I'm going to go back here and make this 20 pixels high. I'm going to go back to this and just say question. So now it'll be a big number in the small letters RPM. Okay, all set up, ready to go. Now I want to have these two indicators, the box over on the right and the text indicator on the left, be more dynamic. Alright, so somewhere in our GUI we're going to have a variable that tracks the RPM of the system. So let's add that variable right now, and let's call it RPM, and let's make it an integer. And we'll take this and move it right up to the top of our GUI, basically a global variable. So there it is. Now, the goal here is that indicators are self-enclosed objects that change when something else changes. So in this case, obviously, we want the text to stay updated as the RPM changes. We want perhaps this box to change color as the RPM changes. Now, if you're used to more traditional if-then-else type architectures, or if this, then do this, and this, we're going to invert that and turn it on its head for you. Now, if you're more used to a Java style where you've got event handlers and listeners, or if you're an embedded programmer, you're used to interrupts, this will be more your style. You want to think about this whole system as a very flexible, event-driven system. Every script, every little bit of code is an event handler or an interrupt routine. So think about them as event handlers, interrupt routines, that kind of thing. And the thing that triggers those can be almost any property in the system, including variables. So let's go into this question RPM. And let's go under the question piece of text and add a listener. A listener listens to something in the system. What are we going to listen to? We're going to listen to the variable RPM. Whenever RPM changes, the listener is going to wake up. It's going to test this condition, which there is none here, and then it's going to run its enclosed script if the condition passes or if it doesn't even have a condition. So let's add a script. And in this script, this is where we get to code. We're going to say text, which means my nearest text object parent, which is the one that we want at this question mark, equals toString built-in function RPM. Save. We can close that script. Okay, so let's look at this. The listener wakes up whenever RPM changes. It has no condition, so that by default says it's going to run the script. The script takes the RPM variable, which is an integer, turns it into a string, and assigns it to the nearest parent that is of type text, which is this text node right here, the question mark. So every time RPM changes, this string will be updated at runtime, and you will see it change. So we could have some sort of simulator where we have a timer and increment the value of the RPM. We could have it actually connected to a remote system using link variables, and as the new variable comes in, this will change. So let's also change and modify the color of this box as RPM changes. So I'm going to take this listener, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to go into our indicator box, which I can call, let's give it a name, indicator RPM box. And let's go into this and paste that listener inside this box. Now there's an error because it says text equals toString RPM. Well, it's not inside a text box. If you look all the way up the hierarchy, it's not. This is a box object. So if we go in here and change this to, well, what do we want to happen to this box? I think what we want is, let's say it to be red if the RPM is greater than 5,000, blue if it's 0, and green anywhere in between. So if RPM equals 0, then box.innerColor equals, now we want it to be blue, right? So opaque, red, green, blue. Else if RPM less than 5,000, box.innerColor equals, now we want it to be green here, red, green, blue, and otherwise we're redlining here. So box.innerColor equals 0x. Alpha is fully opaque, red, green, blue. And there we go. So we've added a script underneath this box that automatically changes the inner color of this box depending on the RPM variable. Now, one of the things you'll notice if you export and run this GUI is, obviously we're not changing RPM yet at runtime. But when you boot, you're going to see and when it boots, this value of this RPM, let's say, is 0. But you will not see 0 RPM and blue over here, that 0 RPM, happen when you launch the system. Why? Because they're set to question mark red in the initial values, and nothing is forcing these scripts to be run at launch time. So if we want to make sure that the indicators get synced up at launch time to whatever their default values are, and maybe you haven't got them set in the GUI to be exactly that way, you need to have these listeners wake up not just when RPM changes, but when the system initially launches. So what we can do is we can add another listener in the listening to, another source for the event, and that is SHIPLaunch. So we can listen to multiple things. This is RPM, SHIPLaunch. That's either RPM changes or SHIPLaunch changes, then run this script. And we'll do the same thing to this script right here. And so now, when ship launch goes true, ship launch is a global variable that goes true when the GUI first launches. It will run this script, for instance, and since RPM is 0, it will set the inner color to blue when we first launch the system. So now we've created two listeners that are listening to a variable, and as the variable changes, the color of the right box and the indicator on the left box will change. And we can get into how you would change that in the future, but this system allows you to encapsulate how an object works on the screen visually based on state variables or counters or whatever it is that you've got in your GUI. And they're very easy to copy and move around into different places. If we add a second page, add new page, under the display, add new page, and on this page, which is currently blank, let's go and add its background color and just give it a deep green. Okay, so here, this second background color, this second page here, this gray page, I may want a RPM indicator much smaller down in the right-hand corner of the screen. So I can add that. In fact, let me go grab that text frame that we had up here. I'm going to go right-click, copy, and I'm going to paste it into this GUI right here. Now, because it's sitting in the page, it's a lot bigger than we perhaps want. So I'm going to make its outer height, 32, and its width 150, and I want it down in the bottom right-hand corner, so I'm going to horizontally right, text align, bottom. So now we have, text view align, that's the text, center the text, but I want this text frame on the bottom right. There it is, down here. So maybe this is part of a footer. It's a different place, right? Here's our page number 1. It's up in the top right. Here on the second page, it's on the bottom, top left, bottom right. But look at the enclosing code. We've kept the same listener, the same. In this case, it's referring to its own text, and this list script over here is referring to its own text. And we could, for instance, have it shown differently. If we wanted to say it's revolutions per second, we could maybe change RPS over here, and in this case, the script would have to take the RPM and divide it by 60. Oop, that's not the string. The integer variable. There we are. And maybe it's floating point, so we'll put it floating point with 2 decimal places, and now we've got a floating point text to string with 2 decimal places showing revolutions per second with 2 decimal points. So you see how we've just copied, modified, but every object in your GUI throughout the layout that needs to change will have typically an encapsulated listener script or a number of listeners and scripts that modify that object based on some state variable or something happening. So that's an introduction to variables, how variables cause events when they change, and how you can create listeners wherever you want in your GUI to listen to those variables, represent those variable changes in any way you want, and how you might want to use the ship launch alternative event on some of these listeners to make sure that when the GUI first launches that the values in those objects or the state of those objects is initialized correctly on initial GUI launch.